History tends to remember Henry VIII as the king who took 6 wives. What it often overlooks, however, is the deliberate cruelty he imposed on the women who failed to give him what he demanded. When Henry desired something, he was willing to reshape the entire religious order of England to obtain it. And when he grew bored or dissatisfied, he destroyed what he had without hesitation or mercy. The destinies of his wives were not random twists of fate, but carefully engineered displays of absolute power, carried out through a legal system designed to ensure that no woman who wore the crown could ever resist him and live. Henry's break with Rome and the annulment that shook England began with what he called his great matter. By 1527, his wife, Catherine of Aragon, once deeply loved and widely respected, had produced only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. In a kingdom with no tradition of a ruling queen, Henry convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Catherine had briefly been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before Arthur died, and Henry now claimed this union violated biblical law. But Catherine refused to submit. When Henry ordered her to withdraw quietly into a convent, she answered with unshakable resolve, "God never called me to a nunnery. I am the king's true and lawful wife." She was not without powerful allies, most notably her nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who ruled vast lands across Europe. When Henry appealed to Pope Clement VII for an annulment, he found himself trapped by Catherine's political connections. The Pope, unwilling to offend the most powerful ruler in Europe, delayed the decision for 6 years. Henry's response was as radical as it was merciless. If Rome would not grant him what he wanted, he would simply remove Rome entirely. Between 1531 and 1534, he systematically stripped the Pope of authority in England and replaced it with his own. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the king, not the Pope, to be the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a massive shift in power, and it gave Henry complete control over marriage and succession. In May 1533, Thomas Cranmer, Henry's newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared what Rome had refused to recognize. The marriage to Catherine had never been valid. The decision was issued at a specially arranged court at Dunstable Priory, but it was little more than a formality. Henry had already secretly married in Boleyn months earlier. The annulment was simply the official seal on a choice Henry had made long before. The split from Rome was not just about love or inheritance. It established a dangerous precedent that would haunt Henry's future wives. The king's will was now law, enforced through a religious and legal system that answered only to him. Any woman who became queen existed entirely at his mercy, with no higher authority to appeal to and no protection beyond what Henry allowed. The machinery of punishment was now fully operational, and Boleyn had waited 7 years to become queen, refusing to be Henry's mistress until marriage. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and unafraid to challenge the king in ways Catherine never had. But by 1536, she had committed the same unforgivable crime. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no surviving son. After a miscarriage in January 1536 that appeared to have been a male child, Henry's patience collapsed. What followed was a textbook example of judicial execution disguised as law. In late April, while on Watch the May Day just as acknowledged queen, Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was already building the case against her. Within days, 5 men were arrested for allegedly committing adultery with the queen, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were sensational and carefully crafted to horrify, and was accused of seducing these men, of incest with her brother, and even of conspiring to have the king killed. Her downfall was shockingly fast. Arrested on May 2nd, she was taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had once stayed in triumph before her coronation 3 years earlier. This time, she entered as a prisoner accused of high treason. Her trial was held on May 15th in the King's Hall inside the Tower, attended by more than 2,000 spectators eager for scandal. Presiding over the trial was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who would later deliver her sentence. One by one, The accused men had already been tried and executed, now and stood alone. The charges were read aloud, designed to degrade and condemn her. The evidence was weak. Overheard conversations twisted into plots, harmless courtly behavior rebranded as sexual crimes. None of it mattered. The jury found her guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. Norfolk announced the sentence coldly, and would be burned alive or beheaded, as the king wished. Henry, perhaps believing himself merciful, reduced the sentence to beheading and ordered a skilled swordsman from France to ensure a quick death. On May 17th, the 5 men were executed at Tower Hill and remained imprisoned, fully aware that her own end was near. 2 days later, on the morning of May 19th, she walked on a Tower Green wearing a dark gray dress and mantle. A small crowd had gathered to witness the execution of a queen, the first in English history, and spoke briefly, her voice calm. "Good Christian people, I am come here to die according to the law. I accuse no man." She praised Henry as a kind and noble prince and asked for prayers for her soul. Then she knelt, and with a single swift strike of the French sword, her life ended. 6 years later, history repeated itself in almost identical fashion. Katherine Howard was barely out of childhood when Henry married her in July 1540, only 19 days after his annulment from and of Cleves. At around 17 years old, Catherine symbolized youth and vitality to the aging, increasingly suspicious king. He called her his rose without a thorn. The marriage lasted just 16 months. Catherine's fall began with rumors at court about her past. Before becoming queen, she had been involved with Frances Derham, a secretary in the household of her step-grandmother, where Catherine had grown up in chaotic and largely unsupervised conditions. Even worse, after becoming queen, Catherine resumed a secret romantic connection with Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's own gentlemen. Their encounters, arranged with the assistance of Lady Rochford, were reckless from the start and destined to end badly. When Archbishop Cranmer presented the accusations to Henry in November 1541, the king's fury knew no limits. Unlike in Boleyn, Katherine Howard would not be granted a formal trial. Parliament swiftly passed the Royal Attainder by Commission Act, making it high treason for a queen to conceal any past relationships from the king within 20 days of marriage. By definition alone, Catherine was guilty. She spent the winter confined at Sion Abbey before being transferred to the Tower in February 1542. On the night of February 12th, she was informed that she would die the following morning. In a moment that continues to unsettle historians, Catherine asked for the execution block to be brought to her chamber so she could rehearse placing her head upon it. Even in terror, she was determined to face death with dignity. The next morning, February 13th, Catherine was assisted onto the scaffold at Tower Green, frail and barely able to speak. There was no French swordsman this time, no mercy or special treatment. She was executed with a common axe, just another condemned traitor. Lady Rochford followed her moments later, kneeling in Catherine's blood. Both women were buried in unmarked graves in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, joining in Boleyn in death as they had never been united in life. Katherine Howard was likely no more than 19 years old, while Boleyn and Catherine Howard met swift ends on the scaffold. Catherine of Aragon endured a far slower and more deliberate form of punishment. After Henry separated from her in July 1531, she would never see him again. Worse still, she was forbidden from seeing their daughter Mary, who was only 15 at the time. Henry understood precisely how to wound Catherine most deeply. He turned their child into a weapon. For the next 5 years, Catherine was moved from one residence to another, each more isolated and uncomfortable than the last. Her royal household was dismantled, her Spanish servants dismissed one by one until only a small group of loyal attendants remained. The king wanted her alone, cut off from allies, unable to gather support for her cause or for Mary's rights. Catherine remained deeply popular with the English people, and Henry was determined she would never become a symbol of resistance. Catherine refused to accept her reduced status. In every letter, she signed herself Catherine the Queen, She would not recognize the annulment and rejected the title of Princess Dowager that Henry tried to impose on her. This defiance, admirable as it was, only strengthened Henry's resolve to break her. He denied her repeated requests to see Mary, fully aware that the separation inflicted unbearable suffering on both mother and daughter. The message was unmistakable. Obedience would be rewarded, resistance punished. By 1534, matters grew far worse. Parliament passed the Act of Succession, declaring Mary illegitimate and naming Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth as heir to the throne. From her enforced exile, Catherine could do nothing to prevent this legal destruction of her child's birthright. Her health, already fragile in England's damp climate, began to fail. She developed symptoms physicians could not properly treat, possibly cancer, though the diagnosis remains uncertain. In May 1534, Catherine was moved to Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, her final prison. The castle was damp, neglected, and increasingly uncomfortable as her finances dwindled. She lived in only a few rooms, cared for by her remaining Spanish ladies and a handful of servants. Her pleas to see Mary went unanswered. Henry, now married to Anne Boleyn and desperate for the son she had not yet given him, showed no interest in mercy toward the woman he had cast aside. Catherine spent her final months in prayer and writing letters to supporters abroad, especially her nephew, Charles V. She never abandoned hope that her marriage would be recognized as valid and that Mary's rights would be restored. But as winter arrived in late 1535, it became clear she was dying. Her condition worsened rapidly over Christmas and into the new year. She requested permission from Mary to visit one last time. Henry refused. On January 7th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. She was 50 years old. Two of her most loyal servants, Maria de Salinas and Eustace Shopweis, managed to reach her bedside in her final hours. After her death, an examination revealed her heart had turned black, sparking rumors of poisoning, though modern historians believe it was most likely a symptom of cancer. She was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, not as queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales. Yet her tomb would eventually bear the words, Catherine, Queen of England, a small victory claimed only in death. For months later, Anne Boleyn would follow her to the grave, executed on charges of adultery. The irony was impossible to ignore. Catherine had endured years of humiliation and isolation, maintaining her dignity and faith only to die in obscurity, and had risen by replacing Catherine, only to discover that the same machinery of royal punishment she helped create could just as easily destroy her. Henry VIII's treatment of his wives exposes the terrifying nature of absolute power in Tudor England. For these women, there was no escape, no higher authority, no protection beyond the king's favor. And that favor could vanish overnight, replaced by calculated cruelty. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years alone, punished for refusing to deny the truth of her marriage. Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard died on the scaffold, their heads taken by the same legal system Henry designed to serve his desires. So which of Henry VIII's wives suffered the cruelest fate? The swift violence of the executioner's blade, or the slow agony of exile and isolation, denied even the comfort of seeing their children one last time? The women who wore England's crown in the 1530s and 1540s learned what absolute power truly meant. Not the power to rule, but the power to destroy, completely, legally, and with the full authority of both church and state behind it.